Okay, I invite you to take your seat for this final closing session before we welcome also Commissioner Renders for the final keynote speech. Again, welcome for those that have just connected to the conference online, and welcome again to our participants that are here in the room. Again, my name is Nicoletta Pirozzi. I'm the head of the European Union program at the Institute for International Affairs in Rome and coordinator of the UIDEA project. For this session, I'm joined by two exceptional speakers, Herman Rompuy, who is President Emeritus of the European Council and also President of the European Policy Center, and Vivien Schmidt, who is professor at Boston University. So with them, we decided to tackle the issue of a differentiated union in a complex world. We have already reflected somehow on this topic during the conference. We realized that differentiation can still be a useful tool to tackle internal and external challenges. And maybe this is even more the case with the Ukrainian war. As a way to tackle internally persistent fragmentation and even divergence among member states, and externally to give the European Union a tool to make strategic autonomy work and to have a contribution to the new European security order. But of course, we want to hear the reflections of our two speakers, and in particular to learn from them what they think about the role of a differentiated union in a complex world today. Can a differentiated Europe be more effective to tackle the manifold crises the European Union is facing now? I will give the floor, first of all, to Herman Van Rompuy, and then we proceed with Vivien. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope that you will forgive me for also speaking about the world and not just the European Union as such. So much is at stake. There is a clash of values going on, and values are central to a civilization. In a way, it is a clash of civilizations, but not in the way Huntington thought. I apologize for going off topic for a moment this morning. I will be, I warn you, more controversial than usual. The term geopolitics, like many others, is ambiguous. It refers to power relations on a global scale, but there are different kinds: military, economic, moral, and others. And let me apply that briefly to the European Union. The European Union certainly plays a geopolitical role through its common trade policy and through the volume of trade. This is also called geoeconomics. The euro plays a geopolitical role as a reserve currency, 20% of world reserves, and as a means of payment, almost 40% of global international payments and almost half of the EU's global exports are made in euros. But at the same time, the Union is too dependent, not sufficiently strategically autonomous with regard to energy, defense, chips, batteries, the dollar, migratory flows, etc. We are making significant progress last year, but it is still a long way to go. The Union, through its socio-economic role, fulfills the role of a global player. The Union assumes, through its socio-economic and political model, an exemplary function worldwide. It's called soft power. But within the Union, confidence in this has declined sharply in recent years. It's a real paradox. About 20% of Europeans say they no longer believe in political democracy, and the same is valid for the United States. This is where we need to turn the tide. It is no coincidence that the Conference on the Future of Europe focused on this in its work before the outbreak of war. The internal consensus on a democratic renewal at all levels of government is essential to our future. Here, there must be no differentiation on this objective. There is another reflection. There is no European army, any fragmented military landscape within the Union. But the recent debacle in Afghanistan and Russia's setbacks show the limits also of military power. We have known that since Vietnam. Of course, one has to look after one's own security, especially the European Union. In any case, the human and economic costs of any military operation is enormous. A prerequisite for every aspect of geopolitical action is unity, not differentiation. Unity. There is no room for differentiation in war times. For the Union, this is easier to achieve with community powers, such as trade and currency, than with intergovernmental powers. Intergovernmentalism would function more smoothly if it were not for the rule of unanimity. QMV in those matters is a top priority in future proposals about the future of Europe. The QMV for foreign policy may be different from what is currently provided for in the treaties. The aim is not to be blocked by one or a few countries. So you can have a new kind of QMV. Yet the 27 succeeded on an unprecedented scale in imposing sanctions on Russia since 2014. And of course, in the past few weeks. Achieving unanimity outside of times of crisis remains difficult. Brexit gave a boost to military cooperation through the so-called PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation. And the war in Ukraine will hopefully give substance to the so-called strategic compass for stronger security and defense. We spent, with the 27, more on defense than China, but are far from their efficiency due to the heterogeneous character of equipment. More uniformity and less differentiation. More generally, I would like to state that I am not in favor of regional collaborations. It's a time for unity. It's not a time for fragmentation. I'm asking a question, but do Visegrad and the Frugal Four still exist? The war in the East has also dispelled the naive belief that economic interests ultimately prevail. In a non-violent way, we have already seen the return of politics with Brexit and with Trump's trade wars, both of which were anti-economic. Ultranationalism is stronger than purchasing power. This has climbed to a peak with the current war. The German and even European foreign policy was largely a trade policy. This has led to the enormous dependence on Russian energy and on Chinese export markets. The war, ladies and gentlemen, is a return of the tragic. Le retour du tragique. Domenach, his famous book, 1967. A return of the tragic where it is not reason and values that dominate, but other dark and diabolical forces. So we have now to draw the lessons from that. And Germany suffered and caused so much suffering that it chose a different model after 1945. History is now turning back, but not through their fault, of course. Time runs backwards. The rise of nostalgic nationalism also threatens to undermine the multilateral order. In the Trump era, the WTO, UNESCO, the UN itself, NATO came under pressure. World trade, you can call it economic globalization, already reached its peak 13 years ago. But without Trump, the international order was increasingly paid lip service by China and others. The EU had to respond by deploying new tools to defend its economic interests. We remain, Europeans, the strongest believers in multilateralism, albeit with far less naivety. President Biden, too, is still clinging too much to the too many protectionist measures of his predecessor. It is clear that the drive for self-reliance among global actors and our own strategic autonomy will put further pressure on multilateralism. How to protect better our interests without falling into protectionism? But there is also the internal challenge. How to protect our own people better against real or perceived threats, such as unemployment, precarious jobs, climate change, terrorism, corruption, illegal migration, military invasion, pandemics, rising inequalities. It's a task for all governments at all levels of power. How to better protect our people without lapsing into protectionism? That's the question. The climate conferences of Paris 2015 and Glasgow 2021 were still successful in a certain sense, also successful for multilateralism. The EU spoke almost with one voice. Now climate objectives threaten to be pushed aside by the need to become less energy dependent on Russian gas through a greater role of our own coal and a greater role for shale gas. The real energy sovereignty or strategic autonomy lies with the climate policy aimed at renewable energy. Meeting the climate targets would have been very difficult anyway. On climate, it is clear that we are in the same storm, but not in the same boat. Support for poor countries inside and outside Europe is also a much-needed form of solidarity. Can the advancing populism in the West afford it? Question mark. Ladies and gentlemen, because of the war, not only the US is back, but also NATO and the West. Even in Europe, there are probably new candidates for NATO like Finland and Sweden. Putin's geopolitical blunders are piling up. I'm sure that China is not happy with Putin's war, but the aversion to the West is so strong that they will never admit it. And the same goes for India, Pakistan, Indonesia, democracies, though they are. The same aversion can be found in half of the African countries, which have been hit hard by the rise in the price of energy and even more so of food. Putin's soft power is small, but one should not overestimate that of the West. The non-aligned countries from the Cold War period have not disappeared, and Europe has a role to play to reverse the tide. Is the current geopolitical struggle between democracies and authoritarian regimes, is this the current struggle? Apparently, it's a strong narrative. This dichotomy does not apply to the third group of non-aligned countries. As mentioned, the world's largest democracies belong to this group. At the time, the West included dictatorships such as Saudi Arabia. This is not so clear today. The connection between China and Russia is not so much that they are both authoritarian, they have no democratic past, but that they are against the West. What is Europe's position in this new world? Originally, the idea of strategic autonomy was also invented to oppose Trump's America. But the war has made Europe realize the importance of NATO again. It has even given the alliance a new raison d'être, a reason to exist, spurred on by most of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. But what happens in the event of a possible return of Trump? The Republican Party is, if possible, even harsher than Biden in their anti-Russia stance. But will it stay that way? The policy of the European sovereignty should therefore on no account there should therefore not be abandoned in the event of a possible new switch in American policy, which for the last 20 years has oscillated between multilateralism and unilateralism back and forth. Nevertheless, I argue for Atlantic solidarity. We should take this opportunity to greatly strengthen this opportunity of the war, if there is an opportunity, to greatly strengthen transatlantic relations, abandoning the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, a few years ago, was a missed opportunity. In a different way, we need to restore it. The EU and the US can set international standards in many areas. But at the same time, as I said, we have to deepen our work and work further on our own technological, economic, monetary, and military cooperation and integration. This will give substance to a truly balanced partnership. The enlargement of the Union, it was discussed in the previous panel, to Central and Eastern Europe was a real geopolitical operation. But there is great disappointment at the violation of democratic principles in some countries. The war has shown that the EU shares the fear of Russia of a number of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Hopefully, some now better understand the concerns of an overwhelming majority of member states about democratic values in the Union. We are in solidarity with Poland, but we must stand in solidarity behind the treaties. The Union wishes to ensure that there is no repetition of these in further enlargements, however great the importance of the Western Balkans and peace there is. For Ukraine, but also for Georgia and Moldova, an intermediate stage must be sought on the basis of the existing association agreements, a kind of upgrade of the present relationship, and of course, a much greater guarantee of security. If necessary, the EU treaty should be amended for this. Those countries and their citizens, they deserve it. The war is far from over and will require us to work together even more. At the same time, we must seize this major crisis to build a true strategic autonomy. We should not wait for the results of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Strategic autonomy is a matter of survival. It is a matter of survival. The Romans said, Barbaros ante portas. The enemies of our way of life are at the door. Over decades, let's be more united around what we built together. Thank you.
Thank you, President, for this broad reflection about the state of play and also, outlining the tensions that we have at present between the dynamics of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and on the other side, the relevance of values, norms, and also ideas. You claim there is no room for differentiation in war times and also no space for regional cooperation. I want to hear what is Vivien's take on that and if there is space for a differentiated Europe nowadays. Please, Vivien.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, President Van Rompuy. It was really wonderful. And it made me think that I should start my comments in a different way, which is, since you began talking about a clash of values, I think I need to talk about a clash of big ideas that we're confronting right now. And it seems to me, these three big ideas are neoliberalism, populism, and progressivism. So I think the big question for us now is, will neoliberalism be resilient? And I think most people would agree when I say, or maybe not, but anyway, that neoliberalism has gone too far, that we've seen hyperglobalization leading to rise of major inequalities, the financialization of everything, deregulation of labor in a way that has made it very difficult for working people to be heard. And of course, the rationalization of the welfare state, all of this leading to major sources of discontent, the socioeconomics of people feeling left behind, the sociocultural worries about loss of status that also morphs into fear and anger about the changing faces of the nation. So that's about anti-immigration. And then, of course, there are the issues of the regulatory state and technocracy, certainly necessary, but at the same time, what we've seen is a hollowing out of democracy, in particular at the national level, as more and more supranational decisions are being made. So we've gotten the politics of, take back control. Brexit, if it's not that, what is it? And citizens feeling increasingly less and less impact, the hollowing out of mainstream parties, and as we see with the French elections, the collapse of mainstream center-left and center-right in favor of the extremes. And we see the Eurozone crisis response as very much neoliberal or ordoliberal focus on austerity, which actually all of this ends up with the populist backlash. So if the first set of ideas is neoliberalism and the question, will this come back? Will it be resilient? The second is, what about the populist backlash? And I've already mentioned the sort of the background sources of populism in terms of neoliberalism going too far. And here we can talk about the sort of what we see is that the neoliberal economic shifts have created the milieu in which populism has thrived. So we get the messages, anti-system, anti-elite, anti-globalization, with messengers, charismatic leaders who claim authenticity as they lie, sort of big lies, as Trump would say, hyperbolic exaggeration. And of course, the media, social media, in addition to traditional media, but social media that actually supports sort of the spread of these kind of anti-system messages, the decentering of power, essentially, sort of bottom up. And of course, Russian bots, we can add that to all of this. So is it just neoliberal resilience or populist backlash? No, there's also what we could say is the progressive push for sustainable, equitable growth. I think that's the big idea, and I think that's the big idea for the EU since COVID. There was a real major turn in terms of, at the moment of COVID, with the taboo breaking Next Generation EU and the Resilience and Recovery Fund. I think this is all tremendously important. And this is not to say that it was just with COVID. We certainly know that the Commission and the member states, some of them, had been working on this for a very long time, about the green transition, the digital transformation, as well as the need to address inequality. Certainly, we've seen this for a very long time, but it's really only with the major crisis of COVID that you see this kind of breakthrough. So the big question is, what next? And for that, I go back now to the remarks I was originally going to say, which would be in response to Nicoletta's question, which was, can a differentiated union navigate more effectively the complexity of today's and tomorrow's global affairs? And I think the question has three different possible answers: no, yes, maybe. So 3 scenarios, basically, one highly pessimistic, one highly, you will all say, overly optimistic, and one perhaps realistic, but probably with a bit of optimism. So first, the beginning pessimistic one. So, taking us beyond President Van Rompuy's suggestion that the problem will be Trump in 2024 or even 2022 with the midterm elections, I think we have a serious question coming up on Sunday. What happens if Marine Le Pen is elected president? Yes, there's a slim chance. Accidents, as we know, unfortunately, happen. So what would happen if Marine Le Pen becomes president? Her discourse seems much more liberal than it was, but that's only if we forget that much of what she's proposing violates EU treaties, the Charter of Human Rights, etc. Just take the forbidding le voile, the headscarf in public, claiming that it's a marker of ideology. This obviously goes against freedom of religion and the whole human rights policies of the EU. Her referendum on identity and nation, giving priority to France, obviously, to French citizens, is obviously a major, major problem. Strangers, meaning not just third country nationals, but also EU citizens, would have less access to jobs, to social services, to social assistance, etc. Clearly flying in the face of the EU treaties. She would also engage in referendums on everything, thus trying to get around the checks and balances of representative institutions, of the judiciary, etc. All very problematic. But of course, for the EU, this is a different idea of Europe. In the debate last night, she said again, I want a Europe of nations. And Macron responded, what does that mean? That means Frexit. Even if it doesn't mean Frexit, it is a Europe where she would try to turn, along with some of the Central and Eastern European countries, to different values, different norms. It would involve no shared EU level debt, as far as I can tell, no Franco-German partner, because France would not be a partner anymore. The reduction of the French budget in terms of contributions to EU debt, and the supremacy of EU law over national law, with France first. She would join, and here I'm just going to list some of the nightmares. She would join the Solidarity coalition with Central and Eastern European countries, so that would be Hungary and Poland. There would be no possibility of a common asylum and immigration policy, although we've not seen much of one already. But it would also violate, what she would do would be violating the Geneva Convention on Human Rights. She would join the Frugal Coalition, assuming it still exists after the Ukraine. No shared EU level debt. Certainly the Resilience and Recovery Fund would remain temporary. No shared debt for issues of security, energy, etc. Would violate Schengen, border controls to ensure against foreigners. I don't know how long you want me to continue with this. Forget ambitions for common security and defense. Her closeness to Putin. She would stop sending arms to the Ukraine, withdraw from NATO's integrated command. And I don't think I need to talk about the single market on top of this, and attacks on the 4 freedoms, in particular circulation of the peoples, but also circulation of goods, because there would be border checks on goods as well. So actually, this pessimistic scenario is probably differentiated disintegration that we're talking about. Okay, but what about the optimistic scenario? Macron gets elected, he plays his role as the leader, basically the main leader with a vision for the EU, and we'd have to say he does everything he promises, which is a big thing, along with working cooperatively with the Franco-German couple. So for the EU, we see a progressive vision, more shared debt, and major ambitions on all fronts. You know, just take Macron's speech when taking up the presidency, the French presidency of the EU. This is going to be a sovereign Europe on frontiers, defense, real capability beyond, with and beyond NATO. So here I think we could envision true strategic autonomy. I mean, this could involve continuing to work within NATO, but develop a separate capability, and ultimately perhaps taking over NATO, certainly at least in terms of regional areas. It would be a greener Europe. He talked about climate ambition and social justice, but this would be what we've already talked about in terms of the sort of the three big ideas, the progressive one. A digital Europe working on privacy issues, as well as taxation of the big digital platforms, a more social Europe, decent minimum salary for all. We should suggest that he does that in France as well. At least Marine Le Pen suggests that, but okay, leave that aside. A more humane Europe. Conference on the Future of Europe was his idea, and as we heard Daniel Freund say earlier, that actually that's been more of a success than he might have expected under, you know, given the limits that had been placed on it as well. So a Europe, as he said, as Macron suggested, more closer to the citizens. Clearly, this would be one in which you defend the rule of law, but also on the money. EU level debt would certainly become permanent as opposed to the temporary fund. And this would be for the Eurozone. I would suggest that also there would be the loosening of the fiscal rules. There'd be a serious focus on growth. I would almost say, as opposed to stability, but perhaps we could still say, given German concerns, with stability as well. And of course, new debt facilities would be necessary for defense and for energy. In terms of EU governance, I'd like to go beyond this because we've been talking about differentiated integration and what that means, and listening to President Van Rompuy suggesting that differentiation at this moment is problematic, certainly in terms of defense and security and in terms of that. But one would have to ask, how does one engage in moving forward, in particular if some countries or some member states are not interested. And in this way, one would need to continue to talk about differentiated integration, but how? So one would be what I would call differentiated deepening, which would mean more EU level resources at the same time as more allowing for more national differentiation. We keep forgetting, or we don't forget, we recognize that part of the problem is that often the EU has more moved forward and has assumed that everything has to be uniform in that way. And I take the Eurozone crisis, which I've worked on most recently, as highly problematic. The sort of the one size fits all rules for everyone, sort of the way in which in 2010 to 2012, austerity and structural reform policies were essentially one size fits all for everyone, but in fact, this was one size that fit one. Okay, I don't need to go there, but you know, it was much more. It was essentially these kinds of policies worked well in Northern Europe. They did not work in Southern Europe. So the question is, how does one loosen the rules, loosen the fiscal rules, but also make them work? I'm not saying that one should allow for fiscal irresponsibility, but how does one ensure growth? And that is, given the different varieties of capitalism across Europe, it means differential approaches, different ways of applying this. One more thing here, this is all the progressive one, and then I'll be very quick on the realistic, differentiated widening. And this is the whole question of how do we move forward? How do we keep encouraging the Western Balkans, the Moldova, and the Ukraine and Georgia to continue on a democratic line, to want to integrate. They want to integrate with the EU, but how do we do this? We do know that the long accession processes that happened before had very negative consequences in terms of turning off countries. So how do you do that? And I would suggest, but I know we've already had a discussion of this, that one allows for a kind of graduated or incremental membership, where those policy areas where countries find themselves increasingly involved, where they meet the criteria, then they can become part of those policy communities with not just voice, which they should be able to have in many other areas, but also vote. So it may be in one single area or two or three where they begin to be able to exercise vote. And I think that's really important to also, this is about sitting at the table and learning the table manners. If you keep them outside and say you have to do this, 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 and this, and it's going to be 15, 20, 30 years, geopolitically, this is really dangerous for Europe. So how do you bring them in and give them partial or incremental, if you will, membership, so that this is no longer just either or with disappointment along the way? But that's ideal. Oh, and of course there is better governance and the unanimity rule, as President Rompuy said. Okay, but this is perhaps pie in the sky. What's the realistic view? Muddling through, unanimity continues, rule of law remains a problem, EU level debt remains temporary. Money, in terms of money, the frugals gain the upper hand as inflation threatens. The Ukraine war becomes an Afghanistan that just goes on and on and on, and people lose interest in focus. And so there's less and less of an attempt to do much about this. Accession drags on and on and on. And there's a slow drift of the Balkans, perhaps, eastward. And in terms of defense, the EU, there's less hope for EU security autonomy with the shift to NATO in the Ukraine war. And I think I could probably end there.
Okay,
maybe
things
one could say.
Okay, okay, Vivien, thanks. So we can have also some space for questions. I think there will be a lot of questions for the many issues you have raised. You added, of course, some additional internal challenges the European Union is faces, and you also designed some complex scenarios for one reason or the other. So let me open the floor right away. I already see two people for questions. So first of all,
I'm most grateful for most interesting discussion, as I'm quite sure we all are. It is not necessary to adopt the Le Pen-Trump scenario to agree that we need a stronger and reformed EU. And that I'm pleased that we are increasingly agreed that will in part require treaty change. And I would suggest that in order to bridge the gap between the end of the conference on the future of Europe and a convention, which we will have to have, a reflection group of experts ought to be tasked with preparing a convention, drafting the options for treaty change on a comprehensive spectrum, because I don't think that to plunge into a convention now, so poorly prepared as we are, would be the optimum outcome. But I particularly was anxious to include in the agenda bridging the historic divide between NATO and the EU. We need to assist NATO to think strategically much better than it has, and we need to assist the EU to act militarily on the security nexus much better than it can at the moment. And the idea that is being discussed of a European Security Council embracing all members of the EU and all members of NATO, including the transatlantic partners, seems to me to be an increasingly attractive and indeed feasible option. And I'd be most grateful, especially to hear from President Van Rompuy, if he would be in favor of such an experiment in fresh structures to address the present dangers.
Thank you.
No, my name is Henrik Leitenberger. I'm a consultant at Milton Europe. I had two questions. The first about the big ideas, if you so will. So you spoke a lot about neoliberalism as being kind of, I mean, you basically established this narrative of, you know, populism being a backlash to neoliberalism and to a lesser extent, essentially, of progressiveness to a certain extent. I would like to ask you a bit more about the use of the term neoliberal here. Because, I mean, to be a bit flippant, whenever I have heard, you know, people use the word neoliberal, they mostly kind of talk about a collection of economic and some extent other policies of the last 20 years that they basically didn't like. But but I've never heard kind of a conceptual definition of what neoliberalism truly stands for. It's kind of this mix of, you know, economic liberalism paired with a few corporatist ideas, essentially, because at the end of the day, if you think that the entire last 20 years have been about market logic, that doesn't really square, essentially, because it doesn't make sense from a market perspective, for instance, to make yourself completely dependent in energy terms on one nation, as, for instance, Germany has done with Russia, for it to give just one example. So, in a way, is perhaps the... And it also doesn't square the fact, for instance, that when you look at who is now providing the bulk of support to populists, it's not, you know, a working class rising kind of in, even though that is the narrative that populists themselves like to use. It's not a working class, you know, unanimously standing up to the elites. It's also, you know, the haves, and to many extent, who are afraid of kind of power going away from them and losing a kind of more economic power, rather than essentially power that they never had and then being completely excluded from it. And that kind of, in a way, absolves the identity angle. I sometimes think, if we just talk about economic policy here, that this is about, yeah, values essentially of people who already have a lot and do not want to share it with others, to put it again a bit more bluntly. The second one is when it comes to the question of then what is it that has undermined democratic legitimacy? Must we not also ask a bit about what the far left has done, essentially, in undermining it? Because anti-system messages have been popularized over the last 30 years, very much from the far left. And if we think about where did the populist wave start, it did not really start on the right. We had Syriza, we had Podemos, we have now also in France still Mélenchon, essentially, who have been pushing these anti-capitalist, and also anti-establishment messages for years. And what we have now is that they have been fused with issues of identity on the right. So is there perhaps a bit more room for a more differentiated narrative that goes beyond essentially the right-wing or, you know, center-left governments that adopted right-wing economic policies are to blame for what we are in now?
Thanks. Mariam? Okay. Okay. Please, I mean, I have 3 requests for questions. We have 8 minutes before the commissioner comes in, so please be brief, and I will give a few minutes to the speakers to reply. You can pick and choose, of course, the different questions.
Thanks. I have a very quick question. Mariam from the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, and I have a question to Mr. Van Rompuy. You said that, you suggested that an upgraded association agreements should be needed for the associated trio. If I understand correctly, that means that you wouldn't really advocate for granting the candidacy status to the 3 countries. At the same time, you said that EU needs to step up providing security guarantees for these countries, or at least step up these countries' security in various ways. However, if the European Union doesn't really have much competence in security, while at the same time it is definitely able to provide or to offer integration to this country. So my question is very simple. How do you see EU providing security guarantees to these countries while at the same time not offering them EU integration, which it is, I think, more in a position to offer than security? Thanks.
Thanks. Over there.
Thank you. I will be short. So Tyyni Karjalainen from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I would like to just ask, since you mentioned that in security and defense policy, differentiation is a risk. How do you see it now with the strategic compass as well? Is it also a possibility to deepen integration, differentiation to smaller groups of states?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Last one.
Very briefly, Marco Sidi, also from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I would like to come back to what President Van Rompuy stated before. Yes, economic interdependence with Russia and China hasn't worked really. But then we should also ask this question, would we be really better off without any economic ties? It's a tricky question. Now we have, for example, this option of the oil embargo, which is the nuclear option. How would it be without that? And then, of course, we can say we don't do a trade with, let's say, barbarians. But then again, this is a trope that has been used and also traced in academic literature for centuries, the barbarian at the gate. Is Europe really better off by dehumanizing the opponent, even while the opponent is doing very nasty things, let's say? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So, President, would you like to start with the questions that were addressed to you?
I have 3 minutes to
4.
solve all our problems. So, very briefly, but you have
Some
to
indications.
You have to recall the questions, but there are so many that I attempted to forget some. So, on the conference on the future of Europe and the convention, we have a difference of opinion on this for years. For me, treaty change, and I suggested several treaty changes, you don't need an overhaul of the EU structures for agreeing on some kinds of important treaty changes. I mentioned foreign policy, I mentioned an intermediate stage between association agreements and full membership. So you can have functional targeted treaty changes. But my problem with the convention is at this stage, and Professor mentioned what could happen in France. I'm still more confident than that. But what could happen in France or in Italy, you don't know, because the pessimistic picture is not the full one. I can even add some elements on it. So in this climate of Euro negativism, taking the risk of a convention is really too much. I'm happy with you said, you have to prepare it as was done, as we did in the preparation of the convention. We had these reports of Jean-Luc Dehaene was there involved, and Amato was involved, and I think an Englishman, and they prepared the terrain. But still, in the current circumstances, you take a huge risk. And we can do a lot. We have seen that in the COVID period. We have seen this a few weeks ago. You can do a lot within the current treaties. And we surprised everybody by, let's say, the European determination and the policy stance. And we did it within the current structures. So that's my first, not an answer, but a reply. On the question about what do you mean by an upgrade of an association agreement and how combine this with security guarantees, it can be two different tracks. You have to be creative in this. You can have something that is more, let's say, in the line of EU integration, and you need treaty change for that kind of upgrade. But at the same time, you can have a different kind of guarantee of the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine based on an intergovernmental agreement, based on what was done in '95 in Vienna and so on, but then with stronger guarantees than in '95. So you can have different tracks to reach the same aim, the same objective. that's my second reaction. On neoliberalism, and I avoided all my life some kind of ideological discussions. Most of them leads nowhere. But we are not, and that's the paradox, we are not living in a neoliberal world. In most of the European countries, public expenditures are as big as 45 to 50% of GDP. That's not neoliberalism. Huh? Of course, I know that there is a lot of liberalization at a more global level, but we transform profoundly our societies, more profoundly than in the United States. But at the same time, what we have seen these last years is that even so-called capitalists, as President Trump, are giving some kind of priority to the intervention of politics. The trade war was against globalization, made by a neoliberal. So you have to approach this kind of topics with a lot of nuances. I translate it in a very general way, that we have to protect people better at all levels of power against the excesses of globalization, digitalization, liberalization in general, and so on. So we have to do it, but you can do this, in my view, and keeping the main advantages of open markets. Of course, it needs a new kind of balance internally and at a European and global level. But again, we are not living in a neoliberal world. We changed already our societies already years ago, decades ago, much more profoundly than that. And there was a last question that I forgot. Security. No, that was the question that you raised at the end, reacting in a human way and not using the word barbaros. I studied Latin. Of course, in Latin, barbaros means something different than barbarians. It's the foreigners are anteportas. But I assume too much that everybody studied Latin. But this less inhuman than you could imagine. But nevertheless, what is happening now in Ukraine is the opposite of all human values and humanity. So we have to put the responsibilities where they really are. They really are. I'm still under the shock of what happened 24th of February and all what followed. I'm living under that shock. I thought that we lived in another world, and that was progress in human civilization. I discovered that I was naive. Most of the time I'm not, but I thought that there was some acquis, some achievements in history. And now we are confronted with what Stefan Zweig called die Welt von gestern, the world of yesterday. We thought it was over. It's not over. It's not over. So in Latin, barbaros means foreigner, but if you ask me my gut feeling, I say no, translated by barbarians.
Thank you, President. Vivien, please.
Yes, so I just I agree entirely about it's much more complex than the three big ideas that I laid out in terms of what we get in reality, but these are driving ideas. And for neoliberalism, and I've got a book entitled, co-edited book entitled Resilient Liberalism in Europe's Political Economy that came out in 2013 that gives you all the sort of much more variegated definition of it. But I mean, if you want to generally say it's a sort of it's an assumption that the markets are always good and the state is not. I think what we've already arrived at this point is a recognition that you need the state, that we need managed globalization. That when I said neoliberalism gone too far, it's the inability to find ways to manage, let's say, sort of the problems of the financial markets, the rising inequalities that have all given rise to a populist backlash. I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation between neoliberalism and populism, but that you have a backlash. And there are many different reasons for why you have populism. But one aspect of it is sort of the socioeconomics of people feeling left behind and the problems that globalization has created in many ways, that it's not just the EU, but generally advanced industrialized economies in particular have not really responded to. And that's really the point. But, I'm very hopeful about the continuation of the response to COVID, where we've seen a major increase in EU level cooperation, as opposed to the previous, if you want, it's a positive politicization to try to do what's right. The Ukraine crisis clearly has, I think, cast a pall over everything. And now it's the moment to see how far the EU can go to make this right as well.
Thank you so much, Vivien. I thank both of you for this inspiring concluding session, and also for the provocative talks that you have provided, not only about differentiation, but also about the underlying ideas of EU integration. So please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you so much.